My mom said, if I disappeared, no one would notice. Funny how quiet it got when I didn't. So last Sunday, my mom turned me into a punchline in front of our entire family. And the worst part, she called it just a joke. My name's Grace Miller, I'm 29, and I've spent my whole life being the quiet one at the end of the table, the one people forget to pass the gravy to. My mom, Margaret, runs our family like a PR campaign. Perfect smiles, perfect outfits, perfect lies. And then there's me, the black coffee in a house full of champagne. Every year, the Millers host a giant family reunion in our backyard in Cedarville, Ohio. White tents, live band, expensive wine, and more fake hugs than a church lobby on Easter Sunday. It's like a performance where everyone pretends they're closer than they really are. Aunt Brenda brags about her daughter's promotion at Google. Uncle Ray complains about taxes right after showing off his new Tesla. And Mom, she floats through it all like a queen inspecting her kingdom, holding her wine glass like it's a scepter. That day, the sun was too bright, the laughter too loud. I sat at the far end of the long picnic table, where the tablecloth already had stains, and nobody cared enough to notice. I'd learned years ago that it was safer to stay at the edge. When you're invisible, no one aims at you. At least that's what I thought. Mom was in her element, telling stories about how Ryan, my son, just got another scholarship, and how Grace's freelancing is, well, it keeps her busy. The kind of passive-aggressive compliment that sounds polite but cuts deep. I smiled, nodded, kept my head down. That's what I always did. Keep the peace, keep quiet, keep existing on low volume. Then it happened. She raised her glass, tapping the rim for attention. You know, she said, smiling that perfectly rehearsed smile, if Grace disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. Laughter, loud, cruel, echoing. First my cousins, then Aunt Brenda's obnoxious snort. Even Ryan, my golden boy brother, laughed between bites of barbecue. And my dad, he just shook his head and said, Margaret, you're terrible. But he was laughing too. That's the thing about cruelty in families. It doesn't come with knives. It comes with smiles. I remember staring at the condensation running down my glass of lemonade, watching it slide like tears I wasn't allowed to shed. My chest felt hollow, like something had been scooped out. But outside I stayed calm, because that's what they expect you to do. To take the hit, laugh it off, and disappear quietly like they joked about. Inside, though, something cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet snap. The kind that doesn't heal back the same. When the laughter finally died, I looked up. Are you done? I said. My voice sounded calm, too calm. Mom tilted her head like a bird pretending curiosity. Oh, sweetheart, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke. I smiled, small and sharp. That's okay, I said. I was just waiting for the right moment, too. She laughed again, that fake, confident laugh she uses when she doesn't understand the joke. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Because while everyone at that table thought I was weak, I knew something none of them did. Something that would change everything soon. See, 2 weeks earlier, my grandfather, her father, had handed me an envelope. His voice was shaky but clear. Grace, if they ever make you feel small again, show them what they forgot. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. But after that joke, I understood exactly what he'd been preparing me for. Dinner went on like nothing happened. People chatted about their lake houses and new diets, while I sat there, smiling faintly, tasting the bitterness that only truth can leave behind. Every now and then, someone would look my way, maybe expecting a scene, but I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I just sat there, quiet, composed, unbothered, while my mother basked in her own spotlight, not realizing her little joke had just lit the fuse on the quietest war she'd ever start. Later that night, as everyone said their goodbyes, Mom hugged me tightly in front of the neighbors, whispering, "Don't be dramatic, Grace. You know I love you." I smiled back, leaned in, and whispered, "Sure, Mom, love you too." But what I really meant was, I finally see you for who you are. When I got home, I placed the envelope Grandpa had given me on my kitchen table. My fingers hovered over the seal. For years, I'd believed that staying silent was the high road, that ignoring cruelty made me stronger. But as I looked at that envelope under the dim kitchen light, I realized something else. Silence doesn't always mean strength. Sometimes it's just the pause before the storm. And I was done being quiet. I didn't open the envelope that night. It just sat there on my kitchen table, staring back at me while the refrigerator hummed like a nervous heartbeat. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine and told myself I didn't care. But I did. God, I did. The words my mom said kept replaying in my head. If Grace disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. Funny thing is, she wasn't wrong. I'd spent years trying not to be noticed. That night, though, I started wondering what would happen if I finally stopped hiding. 2 days later, I cracked the seal. Inside was a folded letter, thick paper, his handwriting shaky but still steady enough to cut through me. Grandpa Frank always had that kind of presence. Quiet, measured, the kind of man who didn't talk much but made everyone else stop talking when he did. He'd been sick for months, heart trouble, but his mind was sharper than anyone gave him credit for. He wrote, "If they ever make you feel small again, show them what they forgot. Inside this envelope is the truth. Don't let them rewrite it." I found a second envelope tucked behind the letter. Official documents with seals, signatures, a lawyer's card, paper clipped to the top. It was his will, the updated one. Turns out, he'd left everything to me. The farm, the savings, even that tiny cabin up in Vermont that everyone used to fight over every 4th of July. I remember staring at my name typed over and over again on those pages, my hands shaking. My first thought wasn't joy, it was guilt, like I'd stolen something. Then I remembered the way Mom laughed that night, the way she looked so proud of humiliating me in front of everyone. And suddenly that guilt melted into something heavier. Not anger exactly, more like resolve. Grandpa had seen things the rest of them didn't. He used to tell me, "The quiet ones hear everything." When I was a kid, he'd sneak me out to the old barn just to escape Mom's chaos. He'd pour lemonade into mason jars and say, "One day you'll need to decide whether you're surviving their noise or living your truth." Back then I didn't get it. Now, sitting alone in my small apartment, surrounded by overdue bills and silence, I finally did. I called the lawyer listed on the document the next morning. His name was Paul Henson, older guy, polite but firm, the kind of voice that made you sit up straight. He confirmed everything. Grandpa had changed his will 6 months before he passed. Completely legally, fully notarized, airtight. Paul said, "Your grandfather wanted to make sure you'd be protected, Grace. He was worried about some behavior he'd noticed." I asked what kind of behavior. He hesitated. He didn't say much, but he mentioned financial inconsistencies and manipulation involving your uncle and mother. I didn't even ask what that meant. I already knew. That evening Ryan called. "My perfect brother," he said. "Mom's furious you didn't show up for brunch. You're being dramatic again, Grace." I wanted to tell him everything, to shove the truth right down his throat, but I didn't. Instead, I just said, "Tell Mom I'm busy living my insignificant little life." He laughed like it was a joke. It wasn't. The next few days felt strange, like living in 2 realities. On the outside, I still worked, still paid rent, still smiled at the neighbors who thought I was sweet but a little quiet. Inside, I was holding the kind of secret that could burn an entire family tree to the ground. Grandpa had even left me a note on a yellow sticky pad that read, "Keep this safe. They'll come for it before they come for you." I taped it inside my journal. I don't know why. Maybe to remind myself that sometimes survival isn't about running. It's about staying exactly where you are until they underestimate you again. One night, I met Mrs. Parker, the old widow from next door, while taking out the trash. She'd known my grandfather for years. She told me, "He used to brag about you, you know. Said you had more backbone than your whole family combined." I laughed, half embarrassed, half ready to cry. She patted my arm and said, "Honey, don't let loud people make you think they're right. They're just scared you'll stop listening." That stuck with me. By the end of that week, the ache had turned into purpose. I organized Grandpa's papers, scanned copies, locked the originals in a safe deposit box. I even practiced what I'd say if they ever tried to challenge me. "It's not revenge," I'd whisper to myself. "It's clarity." And yeah, maybe I was lying a little. That Friday, Mom called. "Grace, your tone the other night was inappropriate," she said, voice sharp and perfectly rehearsed. "Family jokes shouldn't be taken so seriously." I almost laughed. "You're right," I said. "Some jokes just age better than others." She didn't catch the sarcasm, or maybe she did, and pretended not to. Either way, she hung up before I could tell her I knew everything. That was fine, because I wasn't ready to speak yet. Not until the next reunion. Not until I could make sure everyone was there. Every fake smile, every smug laugh, every person who thought I'd always stay quiet. I folded Grandpa's letter again, careful not to smudge his handwriting. It smelled faintly of cedar and old books, like his study used to. I held it against my chest for a second and whispered, "I'll do it right this time." Then I slid it back into the envelope, locked it away, and poured myself another glass of wine. Funny thing about silence, it used to feel like a prison, now it felt like a weapon, and I was finally learning how to use it. The next family reunion came faster than I expected. It was mid-September, one of those crisp Ohio afternoons, where the air smells like grilled corn and fallen leaves. Mom had texted me 2 weeks before. Be there, no excuses. Short, cold, and perfectly her. Part of me didn't want to go. The other part, the one that still heard Grandpa's voice saying, "Show them what they forgot," knew it was time. When I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same. The white tents, the wine table, the fake smiles. Aunt Brenda waved like she hadn't called me poor little Grace behind my back for years. Ryan was bragging to his friends about his internship, wearing the same smug grin he probably practiced in the mirror. Mom spotted me from across the yard and froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice she wasn't expecting me to show up. I brought a small brown envelope with me, tucked neatly into my purse. Not heavy, not dramatic, just paper. But inside was everything: the will, the lawyer's statement, and a flash drive. I'd been waiting for the perfect moment, and I didn't even need to create one. She did it for me. Halfway through dinner, she raised her glass again, that same crystal one she always used when she wanted everyone's attention. "To family," she said, smiling that smile that had fooled half of Cedarville, even the ones who sometimes forget their place. The table laughed. I swear, some people never learn. I set my fork down, wiped my hands with the napkin, and stood up slowly. "You're right, Mom," I said. "Some of us really did forget our place. But don't worry, I brought something to remind you." The air shifted. Every conversation stopped. I reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope, and placed it right in the center of the table. "Grandpa didn't forget his place," I said. "He just wanted to make sure you remembered yours." Mom frowned, trying to laugh it off. "Grace, sit down, we're not doing this." But her eyes flickered. She was nervous. Aunt Brenda leaned forward like she was watching a live soap opera. I slid the documents across the table. "You might want to read these before dessert." Ryan, of course, was the first to grab them. "What is this?" he muttered, flipping through the pages. Then his face changed. "Wait, what the hell?" He looked up, his voice breaking. She owns everything?" The silence that followed was unreal. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the band stopped playing for a moment. Mom's face went pale, her jaw tightening. "This isn't real," she whispered, snatching the papers. "He was sick. He didn't know what he was signing." I smiled, calm and steady. "You're right, he was sick of being lied to." And that's when I pulled out the flash drive, handed it to Dad. "There's something you should hear before you call it fake." He hesitated, then plugged it into the speaker system they were using for the party music. The audio clicked on, crackly at first, then clear. Grandpa's voice filled the air. "Margaret, you can't trick me into signing this. I know what you're doing." Then Mom's voice, sharp, impatient. "Dad, you're confused. Just trust me, it's for the family." And then Uncle Ray chiming in. "Sign it already. Nobody's trying to hurt you." The last sound was a chair scraping and Grandpa saying, "If this is family, then I'd rather leave everything to the one person who still knows what that word means." The recording ended. The silence afterward was heavier than any shouting could have been. Ryan looked like he'd seen a ghost. Aunt Brenda stared down at her plate like she could disappear into it. Mom just froze. Her eyes darted between me and Dad, searching for backup she wasn't going to get. Dad finally spoke. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low but trembling. Mom opened her mouth but no words came out. And for the first time in my life, I saw her small. Not the strong, perfect woman she pretended to be. Just a scared person who finally ran out of lies. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I just looked at her and said, "You should have been careful what you joked about, Mom. Turns out if I disappeared, you really would have lost everything." The irony must have burned because she stood up and stormed off without saying another word. Ryan followed her, muttering something about betrayal. The rest of the family just sat there, stunned, too polite or too scared to look me in the eye. I sat back down, took a sip of my wine, and said softly, "Well, that was fun. Who wants pie?" It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. Years of being invisible, of swallowing my voice, and now the truth was louder than any scream. They finally saw me, not as the disappointment, not as the quiet one, but as the person who'd held the whole truth in her hands and waited for the right moment to drop it. And God, it felt good. Not triumphant, not even angry, just peaceful. Like exhaling after holding your breath for years. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just whispers, "I told you so." The next morning after the reunion, I woke up to what I can only describe as digital warfare. My phone was blowing up. Texts, calls, emails. Someone had posted on Facebook claiming I'd manipulated an old man into changing his will. The comments were brutal. Cousins, neighbors, even Mom's church friends were sharing it like it was a sermon. I hadn't even had my coffee before I was branded a gold digger. The post came from Aunt Brenda, obviously. She always had a flair for drama and a Wi-Fi connection she shouldn't. At first I wanted to reply, to throw screenshots, recordings, anything to shut them up. But then I remembered Grandpa's voice. "Never wrestle with pigs, sweetheart. You'll both get dirty, but only they'll enjoy it." So I didn't post a single word. Instead, I drove straight to the lawyer's office. Paul looked tired, like he'd already read the Facebook chaos. He said, "Grace, you have more leverage than they realize. Stay quiet, stay clean, let them hang themselves with their own rope." That sounded harsh at first, but I understood. Sometimes silence is the loudest microphone. 2 weeks later, everything began to crumble. Uncle Ray's company got flagged for financial irregularities. A local paper ran a short piece about a fraudulent mortgage application, one that listed my grandfather's farm as collateral. Guess who signed the paperwork? Mom and Uncle Ray. Turns out, Dad had quietly sent everything to his lawyer. When he finally called me, his voice was tired but steady. "I'm done protecting her," he said. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. He'd been her shadow for 30 years, always cleaning up her mess. Maybe this time he was cleaning his own soul. Meanwhile, Ryan, my golden boy brother, was spiraling. The university suspended him after anonymous documents revealed he'd forged signatures on financial forms. He called me crying, saying, "You ruined my life." I almost said, "I didn't ruin it, you just stopped hiding it." But I didn't. Instead, I told him something I wish someone had told me years ago. "Ryan, sometimes the truth isn't meant to hurt you, it's meant to free you. You just don't like what it costs." He hung up. Typical. Mom, though, she was quiet. Too quiet. That kind of silence scared me more than her yelling ever did. A week passed, no calls, no posts, no sudden family meetings. Then one evening, I heard a knock at my apartment door. When I looked through the peephole, it was her, dressed in a beige coat, perfect as ever, but her eyes were different, not sharp, not confident, just tired. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked in like she still owned the place. "You destroyed everything," she said, her voice trembling but still trying to sound in control. I stayed seated. "No, Mom, you did that. I just stopped covering it up." She laughed, this bitter little sound that didn't fit her. "You think money makes you better than me?" I shook my head. "No, I think honesty does." She stood there, hands shaking, and said something that will probably echo in my head forever. "He was supposed to leave it to me. I earned it." For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because that's what she truly believed. That love and inheritance were transactions. "He left you what you built, Mom," I said softly. "The lies, the manipulation, the control. That's yours to keep." She left without another word. I sat there for a while, trying to process everything. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was finally over. I realized something in that moment. People like her don't break overnight. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, until they can't tell the difference between love and ownership. A few days later, Dad dropped by with groceries. He looked different, lighter somehow. "You okay?" he asked. "Getting there," I said. He smiled, set down a bag of oranges, and said, "I filed for separation. She can't hurt us anymore." That "us" hit me right in the chest. For years, he never included me in that word. Maybe now he finally saw me as more than the disappointment she said I was. The following weeks were quiet, peaceful even. The Facebook post disappeared. Aunt Brenda went on vacation right after the fraud investigation went public. Ryan deactivated all his accounts, and Mom, she moved out of state. Some said she was starting fresh. I called it running. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to prove and no one left to please. I packed my things, loaded my car, and drove north to the Vermont cabin Grandpa left me. The road trip took 9 hours, but it felt like shedding 9 years of heaviness. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, dusty, quiet, surrounded by pine trees, but it felt alive. There was an old fishing pole by the door, probably his, a single mug in the cupboard, a note taped to the fridge that read, "Keep the coffee strong, the mornings are better that way." That first night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. For once, there was no phone buzzing, no laughter to fake, no one to apologize to, just me. And it was enough. I thought about revenge a lot before all this started, how it would feel to win. But now I realized, winning wasn't the point. Walking away without bitterness was. Sometimes justice isn't a loud victory. It's the silence that follows when the noise finally stops. And mine had. 2 months after I moved into the Vermont cabin, the snow came early, thick, soft, and quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud your old life was. The days slowed down in the best way. I'd wake up to the sound of the creek outside, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and sit by the window watching the mist lift off the lake. For the first time, the silence didn't scare me. It felt earned. I didn't hear much from my family anymore. Dad called sometimes, just to check if I'd eaten or if the heater still worked. He never mentioned Mom, and I never asked. One morning he said, "You know, your grandfather would be proud of you." I didn't answer right away. I just smiled, even though he couldn't see it through the phone. Proud? Maybe. But I think Grandpa would have said it differently. He'd probably just say, "Took you long enough, kid." Life up there was simple. I started fixing things around the cabin, repaired the porch steps, painted the window frames, planted tomatoes in the spring. The neighbors were kind, the type to wave from their trucks instead of making small talk. There was this old man named Earl who stopped by once with a box of firewood. He looked around and said, "Frank used to sit right there every morning, same mug, same frown." I laughed. "Sounds about right," I told him. Earl grinned. He wasn't much for words, but he liked peace. Guess it runs in the family. That sentence stuck with me all day. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I found a small wooden jewelry box tucked behind an old trunk. It was my grandmother's, the one Mom used to claim was lost. Inside were a few faded photos, a pearl necklace, and a folded note with my name on it. My chest tightened before I even opened it. The handwriting was Grandpa's, neat but a little wobbly. It said, "If you're reading this, it means you found your voice. Don't let them convince you that peace requires permission. You've earned your silence, and you've earned your freedom. Remember, what they call betrayal, I call survival." I must have read that note 10 times before I put it down. It was simple, but it felt like he was sitting right there, saying it over black coffee. I laughed through tears, muttering, "You old man, you really saw it all, didn't you?" That letter hit different, not because it justified everything, but because it reminded me that I didn't need to keep defending myself. Some people will never understand why you stopped showing up, and that's okay. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the lawyer. The estate was officially closed, and all the paperwork was done. At the bottom, Paul had scribbled a note. "Your grandfather told me you'd turn this mess into something beautiful. I think he was right." I didn't expect that to make me cry, but it did. Because maybe that's what this whole journey was about. Not revenge, not justice. Just taking back the parts of myself I'd been taught to shrink. Sometimes I'd think about Mom, not in anger, more like curiosity. I heard she moved to Florida with some new friend. I hope she's happy, or at least, I hope she's honest with herself for once. As for Ryan, I saw his name pop up on LinkedIn one day, working at a local auto shop. No college degree, no more golden boy status, but maybe that's good for him. Humility looks better on him than arrogance ever did. Every night, I'd sit by the fire with a mug of tea and let the quiet wrap around me. The world outside kept moving, people posting, bragging, shouting, but up there, time felt merciful. I realized something Grandpa once tried to teach me. Peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the choice to stop responding to it. One morning, while I was walking near the frozen lake, I saw a hawk circling overhead. It moved slow, graceful, completely unbothered by the wind. For some reason, it reminded me of him. I whispered, "You were right," and smiled. Because he'd told me once, sometimes you don't win by fighting harder, you win by walking away first. And that was it. My whole life I thought justice had to be loud, dramatic, cinematic, something people would applaud. But standing there under that gray Vermont sky, I realized justice could also be quiet. It could look like peace, like freedom, like finally waking up and not needing anyone's permission to exist exactly as you are. So yeah, my mom was right about one thing. If I disappeared tomorrow, not everyone would notice. But the people who mattered, the ones who stayed, the ones who saw me, I think they'd miss me. And honestly, that's more than enough. You know, looking back now, I think this story was never really about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about learning that silence can be both a shield and a prison, and knowing when to turn it into strength. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet, letting people walk over me, convincing myself that family means forgiveness. But what I've learned is that love without respect isn't love. It's control dressed up as care. The truth is, sometimes you have to burn bridges, not out of hatred, but to keep yourself from walking back into the fire. My grandfather used to say, "Real gold doesn't fear the fire," and he was right. The flames don't destroy you, they just reveal who was real all along. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look like shouting or fighting. Sometimes it looks like packing your things, walking away, and building a new life in peace. Because peace is not given, it's chosen. And that choice might cost you comfort, family, or approval, but it will give you back yourself. They never apologized, not really, but I forgave them anyway, just not for them. I forgave them so I could stop carrying the weight of their choices on my back, this time on my terms. So if you've ever been made to feel small, remember this. Your worth isn't up for a vote. You don't need their permission to exist, to heal, or to start over. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away to find peace? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories that remind us we're stronger than we think. And wherever you are tonight, may it be quiet, may it be gentle, and may it finally feel like home.